They say that travel broadens the mind, but sometimes it just leaves it vulnerable. When we leave the safety of our own front doors, we enter a world of between places, transient rooms where thousands of strangers have slept before us, boarding gates that lead to heavens we've never seen. We trust the locks on the doors. We trust the pilots in the cockpits. But tonight, that trust is going to fail you. First, we're heading to the Azura Sands, a sun-drenched resort where the most dangerous thing isn't the riptide, but the guest in room 414 who's been waiting 15 years for someone to knock. And then, we'll board a flight that never appears on the radar, a journey where the seating chart starts at 0 and the destination is a memory that refused to die. I'm Susie. Pack your bags, but don't bother with a return ticket. This is the point of no return. Check your corners. Put your tray tables up. We're leaving now. Spring break is supposed to be a hollow space in time. A week where the rules of the real world, deadlines, bills, consequences, simply don't apply. We go to places like the Azura Sands specifically to forget. But sometimes, things don't go quite as planned. This is the resident of 414. The Azura was a masterpiece of architectural distraction, located on a jagged stretch of the Oaxacan coast. It was a sprawling fortress of white stucco and neon blue infinity pools. To Rob, Ashley, and Nick, popular social media influencers, it was paradise. They spent the first 2 days in a blur of salt air and expensive tequila, filming every moment for a following that lived for their vicarious thrills. But paradise has a way of feeling thin if you look at it too long. By the third night, the sun-drenched euphoria was fading into a hazy, jagged exhaustion. The resort felt too big, the hallways were too long, and the staff, they were a bit too quiet. They moved like ghosts through the peripheral vision of the guests, their smiles fixed and frozen, as if they were guarding a secret they weren't allowed to tell. It was 1 a.m. The group was heading back from the late-night lounge, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. They took a wrong turn at the elevator bank, ending up at a wing on the 4th floor that felt different. The air here didn't smell like the expensive hibiscus scent pumped into the lobby. It smelled like salt. Not the fresh spray of the ocean, but the heavy, metallic scent of a tide pool that's been baking in the sun for days. They wandered down a corridor until they came to a dead end, and that's when they saw it, room 414. The door was identical to the others, but the Do Not Disturb sign hanging from the handle was a relic. It wasn't the sleek plastic card used by the rest of the resort. It was heavy cardstock, yellowed and frayed at the edges, the string holding it together looking like it would snap if a breeze hit it. "Look at the carpet," Ashley whispered. They looked. The plush teal carpet of the hallway was worn and matted everywhere else, tracked with the sand and footsteps of 1,000 tourists. But in front of the threshold of 414, the fibers were perfectly upright. There was no way that anyone had walked through that doorway for years. Rob, fueled by that specific brand of bravado that comes from being 22, full of tequila and invincible, pulled a notepad from his pocket. "Maybe they need a wake-up call," he grinned. He scribbled 4 words. "Are you ever coming out?" He folded the paper into a tight square and slid it under the door. They waited, holding their breath. 1 second. 5 seconds. The silence of the hallway felt like it was pressing against their eardrums. Just when they were about to give up, turn around, and head back to their suite, the paper, as if pushed by a single finger, slowly slid back out from under the door. But it wasn't dry anymore. The paper was almost translucent, soaked through with a dark, viscous liquid that left a shimmering trail on the pristine carpet. Rob bent down and carefully picked it up with the tips of his thumb and forefinger. He grimaced. A smell hit him instantly. Stagnant seawater and something sweet, like rotting lilies. He gently unfolded it, trying not to get the liquid all over his hands and clothes. The handwriting wasn't his. It was a jagged, frantic scrawl in ink that refused to dry. "I'm already out. Look behind you." A cold shock of adrenaline washed away the last of the alcohol in Rob's system. He looked at the door. It remained shut. He looked at his friends. Ashley's face was pale. Nick was already backing away toward the elevators. "It's a prank," Rob said, his voice cracking. "The staff is just messing with us." They quickly and noisily retreated to their own suite. They locked the deadbolt. They slid the security chain, but the room felt wrong. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the ocean usually felt like a luxury. Tonight, they felt like a void. Rob stood by the window, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. Behind him, the suite was dimly lit by a single lamp. He saw Ashley sitting on the bed. He saw Nick by the door. And then, he saw a fourth person. Standing directly behind him in the reflection was a man. He was dressed for a vacation that happened at least 15 years ago. A loud, faded Hawaiian shirt, khaki cargo shorts, and a heavy vintage DSLR camera dangling from a strap around his neck. His skin was the color of a wet sidewalk. It hung loosely off his frame, bloated and shimmering with what appeared to be a thin layer of sea slime. He had no eyes, just two dark, bottomless holes in a face that looked like it had been eroded by the tide. The man slowly raised the camera. Click. A blinding white flash erupted, filling the room with the smell of ozone and burnt hair. Rob screamed, throwing his hands over his eyes. When his vision cleared, the room was silent. Ashley and Nick were staring at him, terrified. The man in the Hawaiian shirt was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of panicked phone calls to the front desk that went unanswered. When the sun finally rose, Rob reached for his phone so he could show the front desk the prank note. He opened his photo gallery, and his heart stopped. Every photo from the trip, the beach shots, the group dinners, the selfies, they were all gone. In their place were hundreds of new photos. In every single one, Rob was alone. He was standing inside a room with bare concrete walls and a single rusted bed frame. In the photos, he was screaming, his hands pressed against the glass of a window that didn't exist in the real world. Rob looked up at his friends, but they weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking through him. "Where's Rob?" Ashley asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the empty spot where he had been laying when they went to bed the night before. Rob tried to shout, but no sound came out. He looked at the balcony window. In the reflection, he wasn't there anymore. He panicked and whipped back around, but the scenery had changed. He wasn't in his suite anymore. He was inside a room with bare concrete walls and a single rusted bed frame. He noticed that the door was ajar. As he rushed towards the door, it closed silently and locked, with the tattered "Do Not Disturb" sign slowly swinging on the outside of the door. Check your room numbers, travelers. And if you see a sign that looks a little too old, leave it alone. Some guests never really check out. Rob's story at the Azura Sands reminds us of a hard truth. Some vacations don't end when you check out. Some stay in your camera roll, in your reflections, in the corners of your eyes that you can never quite scrub clean. But maybe you're thinking, I'm safe. I'm leaving. I'm headed to the airport. The gate is in sight. The ticket is in my hand. We like to think of travel as a straight line from point A to point B, but airports are the ultimate in between. Thousands of souls passing through a single corridor, all of them in a hurry to be somewhere else. But what happens when the corridor stretches? When the gate agent's smile doesn't reach her eyes? When the plane waiting on the tarmac belongs to a decade that was supposed to be buried? Our next stop isn't on the map. It's a flight that never landed, and a manifest that's been missing one very specific name. Anita thought she was going home, but the airline had a different plan. 3 a.m. It's a place that isn't a place. It's a transitionary state, a world made of polished linoleum, moving walkways that lead to nowhere, and muffled announcements that sound like they're being whispered from the bottom of a well. At that hour, the logic of the waking world starts to fray at the edges. This is the manifest of the forgotten. Anita was at the end of a 10-day trip through Europe. She was exhausted. That deep, bone-weary fatigue where your eyes burn and the world feels slightly tilted. Her flight home had been delayed 3 times. By the time she reached Terminal 4, the crowds had vanished, the duty-free shops were shuttered behind metal grates, and the neon signs flickering like dying stars. She reached gate B13. The area was deserted, bathed in a sickly fluorescent green light. There were no other passengers in sight. The gate agent appeared from the shadows behind the desk. She didn't walk so much as glide. She was wearing a uniform that looked 30 years out of date, sharp shoulder pads, and a pillbox hat. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on a point just behind Anita's head. Anita held her phone up to the scanner, the QR code bright against the dimness. Beep. The machine didn't turn green, it turned a deep, bruised red. Without a word, the gate agent took Anita's phone, set it face down, and handed her a physical ticket. It wasn't cardstock. It felt like thin, cold vellum. There was no flight number, no boarding group, just 2 words printed in faded typewriter ink. Seat 0. The jet bridge was long, unnaturally long. The air grew colder with every step, smelling of jet fuel and old cigarette smoke. When Anita stepped through the cabin door, she stopped dead. This wasn't a modern Boeing. It was a Lockheed L-1011, a ghost from the 70s. The walls were wood-paneled, the seats covered in a scratchy orange and brown fabric, and there were ashtrays, metal flip-tops built into every armrest. The plane was full. Anita walked down the aisle, her sneakers silent on the carpet. The passengers were still. Perfectly, terrifyingly still. They weren't sleeping, they were staring straight ahead, their hands resting flat on their laps. A woman in a 1940s pillbox suit sat next to a teenager in a neon pink windbreaker from the 80s. A businessman in a 3-piece suit from the 60s sat behind a girl in bell-bottoms. None of them looked at her. None of them breathed. Anita reached the very back of the plane. There was no row 0. There was only a single metal folding chair bolted to the floor in the center of the aisle, facing backward. It stared directly into the dark, open mouth of the rear galley. She sat down. She had to. She didn't even have time to change her mind into plane. The door behind her hissed shut with the finality of a tomb. The takeoff was violent. The plane shook as if it were being torn apart by unseen hands. But the passengers didn't flinch. Their heads didn't even bob with the turbulence. Anita gripped the cold metal of her folding chair, her knuckles white. Once they leveled off, the fastened seatbelt sign stayed on. The cabin lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim blue emergency floor lights. Then, the intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the pilot. It was a recording. grainy, distorted, and heavy with static. It was a woman's voice. She wasn't giving weather updates. She was sobbing. Anita? Anita, can you hear me? Please come back to the gate. We're still waiting at the gate. Anita? The voice looped over and over. Each time it repeated, the sobbing grew more frantic, the static more aggressive. Anita felt a cold sweat break across her forehead. She looked at the man in the last row, the one closest to her folding chair. He was wearing a leisure suit, his hair styled in a perfect frozen pompadour. His skin didn't look like skin at all. It looked like parchment paper stretched over a skull. Slowly, so slowly Anita could hear the dry crackle of his neck tendons. He turned his head. He didn't have pupils. His eyes were the color of a clouded sky. He leaned toward her. The air around him smelled like ozone and dried flowers. "You didn't check the flight status, did you, Anita?" he whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "This flight hasn't landed since 1978. We've been circling, waiting for the manifest to be complete." Anita's heart hammered against her ribs. "I have a ticket!" she gasped, holding up the vellum scrap. "I'm supposed to go home!" The man's mouth pulled back into a wide, lipless grin. "We all had tickets, Anita, but a plane needs a seat 0, a witness. Someone to watch the galley while the rest of us sleep. We've been waiting 48 years for you to board." Anita turned to the galley. The darkness there was shifting. It wasn't just shadows. It was a hand, a pale, elongated hand, reaching out from the food prep area, moving towards her ankles. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Flight 104 from London landed at its destination. The passengers disembarked, hugging their families, complaining about the legroom and the stale coffee. Anita's suitcase, a bright yellow hard shell with an Eiffel Tower sticker on the side, was the first one out on the carousel. It circled for 3 hours. No one claimed it. When the airport police checked the security footage, they found something that made the lead investigator retire the following week. On the video, Anita is seen walking toward gate B13. She stops at the desk. She speaks to a woman who isn't there. Anita is seen taking a piece of paper from thin air. She then turns and walks down a jet bridge. But the footage shows that Anita didn't board a plane. She walked directly into a wall. A solid, concrete wall that had been built 20 years ago to seal off a decommissioned wing of the terminal. She didn't hit the wall. She didn't stop. She simply stepped through it. So next time you're on a red eye and the cabin goes dark, take a look at the very back of the plane. If you see a folding chair facing the wrong way, don't make eye contact with the person sitting there. They've been flying a lot longer than you have. Safe travels, if you can. Anita never made it to the carousel. Rob is still staring at a door that won't open. Travel is a leap of faith, isn't it? We trust the coordinates. We trust the strangers in the uniforms. We trust that the room we booked is exactly what the brochure promised. But tonight, we've seen what happens when the in-between places decide to keep a souvenir. Next time you're standing in a silent terminal at 3 a.m., or walking down a hotel hallway where the carpet feels a little too new, don't just look at your phone. Look at the reflections in the glass. Check the string on your Do Not Disturb sign. And if you see a seat on your boarding pass that doesn't exist, run. I want to know, have you ever had a travel experience that felt like it slipped through the cracks of reality? A flight that felt too long, A hotel room that made the hair on your arm stand up? Tell me your stories in the comments. I'll be reading them tonight from the corner of the room. I'm Susie. This has been a freshly chilled double feature. Safe travels, if you can.